Joining us now is Paul Vallely. He's the author of Pope Francis, The Struggle for the Soul of Catholicism. We thank you for coming to C-SPAN.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we talk about the Pope's visit, can we talk about the theme of your book? When you say there's a struggle for the soul of Catholicism, what would you define it, and what's Pope Francis's role in that?
Yeah, well, the Pope has been trying to do a lot of work across a whole raft of things. The Vatican Bank, the Roman bureaucracy, the sex abuse scandal, the role of women in the Church, the way the Church makes its decisions. And on all of those, he's encountering resistance from different factions who think that he's pushing too far. And so in that sense, it is a struggle for the soul of Catholicism. Some of it is behind-the-scenes resistance, some of it is upfront opposition. But unlike previous popes who wanted to kind of suppress dissent, this pope encourages debate and says, you know, speak boldly, listen with humility, but speak boldly. And when people resist him, he says, that's healthy, let's get it out in the open. So, different style of pope. What
do you think is the source of that openness and engaging debate about issues?
When he was the leader of the Jesuits, he was a very autocratic figure, very authoritarian, strict disciplinarian, rather old-fashioned. And he came a cropper in that because there was a big division in the Jesuits. And at the end of it, they sent him off into exile, and he had 2 years living in the kind of penance, in a wilderness years. And in that time, he changed his leadership style entirely. Whether he had a spiritual or a political conversion is not quite clear, but at the end of it, he's come out as this gentler, more merciful, kinder, softer, kind of inclusive pope.
One of the issues that people talk about is his ability to talk on issues of economics, on the environment, which go beyond the typical role of faith and morals within the Church. Where does that stem from with this pope?
Well, two things. Previous popes have talked about capitalism, communism. For 100 years, the Catholic Church has tried to find a middle way between capitalism and communism, which is a kind of responsible, kinder capitalism. This pope has that tradition, but he's also, for 20 years, he was the bishop of the slums in Argentina. He's got lived experience of the poor. He's from an immigrant family himself. And as a Latin American, he's got an ambivalent relationship to the United States. He sees, you know, both respect and resentment at the power of the bigger neighbor down there in Latin America. So all of that combines to give this pope a kind of vehemence, a passion, which you haven't seen with previous popes who were more academic on this subject.
Now, this pope comes to the United States. What do you think is the goal of this visit of the pope?
Well, two things. One is that there are international events. The World Meeting on Families is the immediate cause. He wants to talk to the UN about climate change because that was a big thing in his most major document, Laudato Si. And he's got the whole raft of issues like the refugee crisis he wants to get into, social inequality. But that's just one side of it. He wants to balance that with visiting the poor, the immigrants, homeless, third graders in Harlem. And he wants to kind of have two messages, one for the leaders, one for the people.
Is the idea that he's addressing politicians, such as the address he'll make in Congress, he'll meet with the president, how does that compare to previous popes who, as far as their political visits and their role of heads of state?
He's more overtly political. Previous popes would have their conversations behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, this pope is very, very frank. When he met President Obama in the Vatican, he said to him, "Look, I'm speaking to you not as pope, but as a Latin American. Now we've got to sort out something about Cuba." That's the way he talks privately. So he's more politically engaged. Pope Benedict was a theologian who put ideas forward in a scholarly way and hoped that people would read his books and they'd be persuaded by reason. But this pope is out there in the political marketplace, you know, doing battle to get his ideas engaged.
You brought up Cuba. Does the Pope have a role in the current warming of relations that the United States and Cuba are currently engaging in?
Absolutely. He wrote a secret letter to Obama and to the Cuban presidents, urging them to take a step forward and begin these negotiations, and he put Vatican diplomats in the heart of that, and they had 8 secret meetings in Canada, and when the negotiations stalled, the Pope said to both the men, "Come on, you know, you can trust me to get you to trust one another. And he wrote another letter so he's been a really big figure in this. He's tried to play it down, but no, he's been a big wheel.
Paul Vallely is the author of Pope Francis, The Struggle for the Soul of Catholicism, here to talk about the Pope's visit and themes in his book. If you want to ask him questions about it as Pope Francis arrives in Washington today, 202-748-8000, our line for Democrats, 202-748-8001 for our line for Republicans, and 202-748-8002, our line for independents. You can tweet thoughts as well at C-SPAN WJ. How would you characterize the church as far as the devotion to the church from other Catholics before this Pope, when it was under Benedict and John Paul, and now? How would you, is there more devotion from those who would follow the church's teachings more closely because of this Pope particularly?
Well, I think that every Pope has his own strengths and his own charisms, and people, different people draw different things from different popes. This Pope has got the common touch. John Paul was a philosopher, Benedict was a theologian. This man's a pastor. He's been in the slums for 20 years. He knows people. He comes across like everybody's, family uncle, favourite uncle. He's warm, and he's got that common touch. And so I think he does actually engage with people in a different way.
From our first call is Michael. Michael is from Indiana for our guest, Democrats line. Michael, good morning.
Good morning. I'm calling from Kokomo, Indiana. I'm actually in a political science class, and we're talking about the impact of special interests on politics.
I think we lost the connection with him. Sorry about that. Again, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, and 202-748-8002 for independents. Talk about his educational background. Where does the Pope come from educationally? What kind of things is he engaged in as far as his studies?
He's from a lower middle class background. He went to a technical school. He trained as a chemist. So it's a bit ironic when people say you should leave science to the scientists. He is actually a scientist in his training. Then he went into the Jesuits, which is a 15-year training, very, very rigorous training in philosophy, theology, but also in outreach. The Jesuits have this speciality. They call themselves contemplatives in action. So they have both sides of the balance there. They're people who sit and think and meditate and pray, but they're also people who want to be engaged in the world. So that really has formed him, and that together with his experience in the slums, is what has actually made him the figure that he is today.
Paula from Washington, D.C. Go ahead, please.
Yes. His Holiness is arriving on the eve of the holiest day of the Jewish year, Yom Kippur, and I have the greatest respect for a lot that the Pope represents, but tonight and tomorrow, he's making it difficult, if not impossible, for some Jewish people not to be able to get to their places of worship because of traffic. Why wasn't that figured in the planning? I don't understand.
Well, that's a good question, and I think it's also the Muslim festival of Eid, and it's very unusual for the Day of Atonement and Eid to be at the same time. So there are problems on that. And the Pope has been very conscious. When he was in Buenos Aires, he had special relations with both the Jewish and the Muslim community. I mean, he's in his cathedral in Buenos Aires, he has a Holocaust memorial, very unusual for a Catholic prelate to do that. So he's been very inclusive of other faiths, and other faiths have by and large been very, very positive about him, as positive, if not more, than the Catholic faithful. So, yeah, I think you're right. This is an unfortunate bit of timing.
You write in your book this, you say, it is difficult business being normal if you are the leader of the world's biggest religious denomination and also a head of state. You also say it can be a complex business being simple. Can you expand on those?
Yeah, well, it comes across as an icon of simplicity, but some of his big gestures are planned. If you look back at his time in Buenos Aires, he did similar things. So he used to take the subway in Buenos Aires or the bus. He didn't have a chauffeur-driven car. He used to live in 2 rooms in the diocesan offices. He didn't use the bishop's palace. So when he came to Rome, he doesn't go in the papal palace. He lives in the guest house with 300 other visiting priests. and he gets the bus with the other cardinals. Those kind of simplicity gestures are both intuitive, but also he knows the impact of them. So I tell a story in the book about how he wants to carry his briefcase onto the plane, and somebody else has already taken it on. He says, no, go and get it, I want to carry it on. And then he carries the briefcase on, and the press say, look, the Pope is carrying his own bag. No Pope has ever carried his own bag before. And the Pope says, yeah, well, I'm a normal guy. I'm just an ordinary Joe. Of course, he's extraordinarily ordinary, but it's that kind of complexity. It's not fake or insincere, but it is thought through.
From Sam in Owings Mill, Maryland. You're next. Hi.
Hi. Paul, earlier in response to a caller, you said that religion has been on both sides of the equation, where it's been, people have done good things in it as well as bad things. But some of the examples you gave were, religion was on both sides simultaneously, depending on who you asked. For example, the abolition of slavery. There were just as many people calling to maintain it and how it was the good Christian duty to maintain that institution at the time.
Well, I think what you've got to take into consideration is that religion, like politics, like nationalism, is often a badge of identity that people have. It's not actually the cause, it's just the external. And the problem when you look at wars and other human problems is that's the key word, human. It's just human nature, and people put a religious badge on it, but in fact it's something more base in our characters and natures, which is what religion actually tries to counter. It tries to lift us to a higher place, whichever religion it is.
What's the Pope's day like at the Vatican?
He gets up in the morning very early. He prays for 2 hours on his own in front of the tabernacle, and that's where he does his thinking and his decision-making, puts them all before God. Then in the morning he goes to work in the papal palace with the officials. He gets through huge amounts of paperwork. In the afternoon he works in his own room in the hostel, where he makes his own calls, makes his own appointments, sees people, and the officials don't know what he's doing half the time. He keeps people on their toes by having his own, he's got his own diary and makes his own calls, and he's quite an independent spirit. So
when you say makes his own calls, does he make his own arrangements for travel or other calls? How does that work?
Well, he phones people who've written to him and gives them pastoral counseling like an ordinary priest would. But there's a very funny story in the book about Alitalia, the Italian airline, phoned the Vatican and said, we've had this guy on the phone, says he's the Pope, wants to book a flight to Lampedusa. Is this real?
202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, and 202-748-8002 for Independents. Our guest, Paul Vallely, the author of Pope Francis, The Struggle for the Soul of Catholicism. Why do you devote so much time writing about the Pope?
Because he's really interesting and he's exciting. And when I go to give lectures at universities or in churches around the world, there's this infectious spirit of joy and optimism. The church has been reinvigorated by this man, and it's catching. The Pope's joy is catching.
Again, our guest with us to talk about the Pope's visit to Washington, D.C. today. If you want to give him a call, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, for Republicans, 202-748-8001 for Independents, 202-748-8002. We also know that the Pope texts, or at least tweets, as far as using Twitter. Why he's not adverse to technology as far as getting a message out?
He's not very good with the technology himself. He doesn't actually send the emails himself. He doesn't send the tweets himself. But other people do it for him. But he approves them all. They distill a tweet message out of his sermon of that day, and they send it to him, and he says, yeah, that's fine, put that out. And I've had friends who've had emails from him, he's technologically savvy, and he's the selfie Pope, isn't he? People are always taking photographs with him, and he's cool with that. He's not stuffy at all. He'll do the pose for the selfie.
Actually, the story in the Washington Post this morning says the Vatican sketched out basic rules when it comes to tweeting. It says that promote Jesus, not Francis. Trickier than it looks when smartphone photos of him are hugging people and tales of him cold calling ordinary Catholics go bananas on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And speaking of Facebook, note Facebook. Facebook is too social of a social medium for the leader of the world's largest church.
Well, the Congress have been told not to take selfies of him because it takes up too much time. It looks too self-regarding. But when he speaks in St. Peter's Square and people shout, Francesco, Francesco, he says, no, don't shout that. Shout Jesus, Jesus. And he's trying to constantly refocus the message. But when the Pope goes up to a man whose skin is covered in terrible boils, which would repel most of us, and he hugs him and he kisses him, then people see Jesus in that.
From Bill in Little Rock, Arkansas, Democrats line. You're next for our guest. Hello.
Yes, good morning.
Morning.
John Paul II wrote an encyclical, and I've been a Catholic all my life, and he basically, his opinion was that the death penalty shouldn't be used, and that's what we've been interested in. I was a prosecutor a long time and prosecuted death cases, but now I've read where Pope Francis, he not only doesn't like the death penalty, but he's also written that he doesn't like life without parole, which John Paul II said should be used because we don't use the death penalty anymore. So I think this Pope is creating a lot of confusion, and for him to just come out and say, you know, life without parole is like a death sentence. I tell you, he's not helping the church at all, and I'm very confused about what to believe. But frankly, since Cardinal Ratzinger even said when he was cardinal that I can disagree with the Pope on the death penalty, and in this case, I choose to. Thank you.
Well, the Pope's attitude, previous popes have had the same attitude to the death penalty. It's not necessary anymore. In a modern society where we can incarcerate people, the death penalty is absolutely not needed. This Pope has gone further, as you indicate, and he said that he doesn't like solitary confinement, he doesn't like life imprisonment, and yeah, you're free to disagree with the Pope on that, but his teaching on the sanctity of life, you know, extends to the other end. It's not just about the unborn, it's also about the death penalty. And I'm afraid that when people use the word confused, I'm confused about this Pope. What they actually mean is they disagree with him. So just be frank, I think.
Fairfax, Virginia, Republican line. Good morning.
Yes, hi, good morning. Well, thank you very much for C-SPAN. I just want to voice one opinion regarding this Pope's visit. I do have a lot of respect for the Pope and what he represents, but I feel that there's a political cloud surrounds his visit. He does have he's an opinionated guy. He does have his own views on a wide array of issues, as he should. But in the first place, as a Pope coming to visit the United States for the first time, I need to see more spiritual message coming from out of his visit. I need to see him speaking against atheism and the lack of belief that most people have now in religion and Christ. He's an ambassador of Christ, as the Catholic Church holds him, and he should have his masters or his Christ's views coming with him, not just the political views. Thank you very much.
I think when he arrives, you'll find that you do get a very, very spiritual message, and he's very rooted in getting the gospel out onto the streets. He says the church has been too long in the sacristy, and it needs to get the message out onto the streets. And that is a deeply spiritual message. I think you'll see that if you watch the masses that he will do here. But he won't be looking at tackling atheism. That's not the way that he approaches things. He reaches out to atheists, and he says to atheists things like, you know, if you behave well, you can get to heaven. Now, that's not something that a lot of people are comfortable with from popes. But he says, look at the message of Jesus. The message of Jesus, which is about mercy and compassion, about love and embracing people, about including people, not about rules, not about excluding people. And if you focus on the message of Jesus, then the world will listen. And that's the message I think he'll be bringing when he gets off the plane today.
Here is Sadie from Silver Spring, Maryland, Independent line. Hi.
Hi. How are you?
Fine, thanks. Go ahead.
I'm a descendant of Portuguese Jews that came into Georgetown and Charleston, South Carolina, before the American Revolution. And I wanted to know what the archives there in Rome had on that subject. Also, I know that the Pope is coming into East Harlem, New York, and I'm a native New Yorker, and actually that was a bastion for the Catholic Church when I was growing up.
Well, the Vatican has had secret archives on a whole range of things for a very long time. And one of the things this Pope has said is that he's going to open the archives on the question of the role of the Vatican and the hierarchy in Argentina in the dirty war there when the military dictatorship killed a lot of people. And there have been requests for him to open the archives on the Vatican and the Nazis, and he's talking about that as well. So he's a man who's open to the secrecy, the veil of the secrecy being lifted, but he's not talking about it as a universal thing. So the particular thing that you asked about, I've not heard any reference to that being lifted as we speak.
Has he made changes to the day-to-day operation of the Vatican?
Very much so, yes. I mean, he's replaced a lot of people who he thought were obstructive. He's kept a lot of people who he doesn't agree with in terms of their ecclesiology, but he's kept them in place. But he's moved people around. He's shifted the emphasis in the department so that the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is the watchdog of doctrine there, that's now regarded as one among equals. Other cardinals criticise what the head of that says. The cardinal who's in charge of, who was like the deputy pope, the Secretary of State, he's had all his finance powers stripped away because the Pope thought that you need a balance of powers. He's created a new finance department. He's done lots of administrative things which will try and put some checks and balances into the way the Vatican works.
Because the Pope lives simply, does he make the Vatican live simply as far as his expenses and cutting those?
Yes, I mean he's put a recruitment freeze on, and he's cut the main thing is his example. The Vatican is in lots of ways like a court, with the courtiers, and everybody copies the king. The king dresses simply and walks. They dress simply and walk, and they put away all their finery and their lace-trimmed vestments, and they're appearing in, who knows what will happen with the next pope. But one of the things that he's done is that he's appointed 39 cardinals, not one of them an American, hardly any from Europe. They're all from what we used to call the Third World, really poor nations like Burma and Burkina Faso, and if he carries on doing that, very soon there'll be a majority in the body that elects the next pope of people from the developing world. So we may find a different kind of style as his successor.
From Hollywood, Florida, here is Julius on our Republican line.
Yes, good morning.
Morning.
I would like to ask a question concerning the Pope's decision on the Ten Commandments and the day of worship. I understand that the Catholic Church is responsible for changing the Sabbath to Sunday, and what would be the Pope's recognition as far as everybody coming back to obey the Ten Commandments, including the true Sabbath day?
I don't see any talk from the Pope at all about changing that. Sunday has traditionally been the day of worship for nearly 2,000 years in the Catholic Church, and that is something which I don't think you're going to see movement on.
Chris from Illinois, good morning. You're next up. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. I just wanted to see if you could give some discussion on the Pope's view from different parts of the world. So, especially in Europe and other developing countries. So he is in America. A lot of people are criticizing him. Some of them are saying the Pope is a Marxist. What are other people around the world, some of the criticisms, and what are they saying?
Well, the media love a bit of controversy, and they focus on the extreme views of the minority of people on both left and right. Most Catholics around the world think this Pope is wonderful, and they're very lifted and encouraged by him. The idea that he's a Marxist is something that he smiles at. He's not a Marxist, he's not a materialist determinist, he's not part of that philosophy at all. But he says, well, some Marxists have done good things, so I don't mind if people want to call me a Marxist. But he says that in a very ironic way. He's certainly not a Marxist, but he's the first Pope from the global south, from the developing world. He's lived amongst the poor for decades, and he looks at the world from the bottom up. he looks at the world differently than the way that people in the United States and people in Europe look at the world. And you've got to remember that when he steps off that plane and he begins to speak, this is a man who's looking at what he sees around him from, somebody said to me, he's still got the dirt of the slums on his shoes.
You write that liberals hail the new freedom, even accusing Pope Francis of bringing division, confusion, uncertainty, and anxiety. Some hardliners see the Pope as Machiavellian, bent on introducing liberalism by stealth. But what is incontestable is that the battle has been joined in which the very future of the church seems at stake.
Yeah, I think both sides have got misunderstandings of the Pope. They view him through a political template. Is he a liberal? Is he a conservative? He's neither. He's a Catholic. And Catholics have a concern for economic justice, for social harmony, which is out of sorts with modern liberal capitalism. And so what he's doing is he's saying to the world, look, there's another way of looking at life, and you've forgotten it. You've just got on this rat track to material success, and you need to think about other things. That's his message.
Yet, though, he's meeting with the president, addressing Congress. I guess anybody could look at that and say he is political just by those actions.
Yeah, but he's bringing to them an alternative point of view. That's what he sees his job as being, and it's the point of view that he sees in the gospel, and all of these different aspects, whether it's the climate change or poverty, they grew out of his vision of what it is that Jesus meant and Jesus wanted, and that's constantly what he communicates. If you look at his teachings, he talks about mercy. Mercy is the thing that Jesus brought most, and that's the message he's got for the world.
Here's Chris from Bolingbrook, Illinois, Republican line for our guest, Paul Vallely. Hello. Chris, go ahead. We'll go next to Steve. Steve's from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Hi.
Hi. I was wondering if a pope or the Catholic Church has ever apologized for the colonization of the Americas and the millions of Native Americans that died for Europeans to have more freedom.
Yes, indeed. When he was in Bolivia and Paraguay recently, he talked about the wrongs that have been done to the indigenous people and the need for people to rectify that. When he was in Argentina as a young man, he was very into something called the theology of the people, which was an Argentinian theology del pueblo. And what it said was that the local culture of people should be respected, and it's been dissed and set aside by the kind of colonial inheritance. And we need a kind of different intellectual framework which takes and respects the views of indigenous people and sees Catholicism from that cultural perspective, not from a kind of European one. So yeah, this is really big on his radar.
Tom is from Illinois, independent line. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I've been listening to the show this morning with several callers and find it interesting. I appreciate your show. But my thought was, the Pope really, pardon me, isn't a political analyst or an economic person telling people what to do in terms of how to structure their governments. He preaches not only mercy, but, biblical in the sense of, when did you feed the poor, the hungry, Lazarus and the rich man, so forth. And so, without getting into too many biblical passages, he's really a shepherd of souls. And my thought is for all of us, really, including myself, is that, America or wherever you're at really kind of needs to think about, where do you stand in relationship to these ideas and your God, basically. I think the Pope had one time said something about prepare for the last judgment and so forth. And so,
I don't think that you and the Pope disagree as much as perhaps some people might imagine, because he's actually used those kind of quotations about feeding the poor, and he said, what does that mean? What does it mean to feed the poor in the modern world? It means changing the economic system so that people at the bottom of the heap have got a fair chance of taking control over their own lives. That's what feed the poor means nowadays. So it's a question of how you interpret the teachings of the Bible in the world that we live in now.
Tom, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I do, and I agree with that. And also, your bigger goal is too that all of us render a judgment to God one day, and none of these economic structures will get you to where you want to be ultimately to save your soul. And so I think people need to look interiorly and what that means to each and every one of us as we progress through life and use each day to value human life.
Yeah, well, the Pope would agree with you on that, and he talks about exactly those issues most of the time. People in the media focus on the politics. The politics just grows out of the other stuff, and it's quite small. If you look at the sermons of the Pope, that he does a homily every day, and he makes these kind of points that you're making. So, yeah, he agrees with you.
Texas is next. That's where Paul is on our Republican line. Hi, Paul.
Good morning. I'd like to make a comment, please, on the statement about atheism. I'd just like to point to John 3:16, where it says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. But those who believe not are condemned already, because they believe not the only begotten Son of God." Now, my question would be, and the other statement says, there's no way under heaven where man can be saved except with the blood of Jesus Christ. So how can the Pope say that atheists can go to heaven? He cannot change the Word of God. It was Jesus himself that made that statement. Your comment, please.
The Pope would agree with the quotation that you've made, but he would say that you need to interpret that in a wider context, in the light of the tradition of the Church. And in the modern world, you need to reach out to atheists and bring them to see the truth of the gospel. And you won't do that by wagging your finger at them. You do that by making them feel welcome.
Is there a tug-of-war between a pope and his personal opinions and then church doctrine? And how does this pope deal with that?
There's always a tug-of-war on that kind of issue. But I haven't seen a huge amount of evidence with this pope that he fundamentally disagrees with any of the church's teachings, and he's just peddling them as the line that he has to peddle. He really believes them. Where you see some interesting contradictions is like on contraception. He says the church teaching is right, that Pope Paul VI, with his document Humanae Vitae, was prophetic. And then on the other hand, he's saying Catholics shouldn't breed like rabbits, there should be responsible parents, and that 3 children in a family is an ideal. Now, what's the message that he's sending there? He says to priests, you should be merciful in the confessional if people confess to using contraception. That's the clearest, that's the nearest example I can give to the answer to your question of where perhaps there's a tension between the official church teaching and his own instincts.
The Pew Research Center recently took a poll in September of this year asking Catholics whether it was not sinful to, and then 66% said it wasn't sinful to use contraceptives, 61% said get a divorce, 39% said engage in homosexual behavior, and 23% said have an abortion. What does that say about the condition of the church and Francis's role and mission to the church?
Well, one of the interesting things is that the Pope himself asked the views of lay people. He sent out a questionnaire. Previous popes were not interested in what lay people thought. They said, we'll tell you what to think. We're the Pope. You're just the lay people. He said, what do you think? And he wants to know how these kind of issues can be interpreted in a more pastoral way in church teaching without losing the truth of the doctrine. So like on communion for remarried Catholics, he doesn't want to say that marriage is not for life. Marriage is for life. But where a marriage has failed, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with the people? And how do we deal with them in such a way that we don't exclude them and their children are cut off from the faith forever because their parents stopped going to church? So these are the kind of bigger, more complex issues that he's trying to deal with in the context of what you just asked.
Next call is Harry, Mount Joy, Pennsylvania, Republican line.
Thank you for taking my call. First, I think this Pope is pandering to the radical left with this man-made climate change nonsense. And second, I'd like to know what his are of the American Catholic Church within the Catholic Communion. And I personally believe that for all its, even though it's in decline, I still think the Catholic Church in the United States is still one of the most important areas of Roman Catholicism in the world today. And I'm not Catholic either, but thank you anyway.
Thank you. Well, the Pope doesn't see it as his job to get what, as one caller put it to me on a program the other day, butts on seats. He's not interested in filling the church. What he's interested in is getting the message of Jesus out to the world, to the church, but to the wider world as well. So he's not particularly concerned about institutional building. He's only concerned about the institution getting the message of Jesus across to the nation and the world. On the climate change issue, he doesn't see it as man-made. He takes the evidence. People told him to leave it to the scientists. The scientists, 97% of scientists who've published on global warming say that humans are largely responsible for the rise. And the Pope has taken that and said, look, we have to do something about this. We've got to do something about the environment more generally, about desertification and pollution. And he feels that this grows out of a sense that you get from the Bible of the creation being handed to us to look after. And he says we're not looking after it, and we're being blinded by a short-term drive for profit all the time, and we need to think about the planet, and we need to think about poor people.
That climate change message, does he deliver that only to the United States or other countries like China and India with their own pollution problems?
Yeah, there are references in the encyclical to those issues. He does feel that some of the developing nations need to be helped financially by the rich world. He says the rich world's created this problem, and the poor are the ones who suffer from it. They're the ones where their homes are flooded when the seas rise or the desert creeps forward, so they need assistance. The rich world has a responsibility on that, but he does also say that this is a global problem. It's not just a problem for the rich.
Helena from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Republican line with Paul Vallely, the author of Pope Francis, The Struggle for the Soul of Catholicism. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. I am a Catholic. My family have been Catholics as far back as I can remember. I'm raising my children through Catholic school. At this point, I'm very, I don't know if the right word is confused, but confused at what Catholics are expected to do. I want the Pope to, I understand climate change. I do think we need to take care of this planet. However, I need him to speak up on how we as parents are to teach our children now about the gay movement. I believe that we need to respect, love, embrace them, but how do we tell our children that in our beliefs that this act of homosexuality is wrong, it's a sin? The Pope needs to clearly define for us, how do we teach our children this? How do we go on from here with this in our society today?
The Pope is fairly clear about this. He thinks that gay people should be welcomed into the church, that their civil rights should be respected, their human rights should be respected, people should be warm and embracing of them, and that they should be allowed to have civil unions. But he doesn't think they should be allowed to call it gay marriage, because marriage is a sacrament, and it's a sacrament between a man and a woman, and he thinks there's a distinction between those two things. On gay adoption, he is against gay adoption, because he says that people who talk about gay adoption are looking at it from the point of view of the parents. You know, my right to have a child. I have as much right as a heterosexual couple to have a child. He says, no, you don't. Nobody has a right to a child. A child is a gift from God. A child is a blessing. And the issue should be looked at from the point of view of the rights of its children. And a child has a right to a mother and a father, and so he's against gay adoption. So it's not the same emphasis as previous popes, where there's been a kind of rather hostile atmosphere to gays. He wants gays to feel welcome in the church, but he draws a clear line on gay marriage and on gay adoption. I think his position's pretty clear, actually, and you could tell your kids that.
Gainesville, Florida. Karen, up next. Hi.
Yes, hello. I appreciate your description of the Pope as being very intelligent and the kindness that he's shown. But to me, it seems like the Vatican is like an old boys club or a fraternity, and it's built on the ideas of rejecting women as a threat to their way of life. And so because of this, they appear very naive about women and their issues today. And I was hoping you could address that.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And the Pope knows there's an issue here. He keeps saying we need a profound new theology of women. But when people say to him, well, can we have women priests? Oh no, the church has spoken against that. Well, what about women cardinals? Because you don't have to be a priest to be a cardinal. No, we don't want any more clerics. There's too many clerics in the world. Well, what about a woman heading a Vatican department? No, you've got to be a cardinal to head a Vatican department. So people say, well, we need this new profound theology. So, you know, he did something quite significant recently. He appointed 5 women to the International Theological Commission, which is a big body within the church. But then when he announced it, he announced them as the strawberries on the cake, and the women didn't like that. So even when he's doing the right thing, he seems to be proceeding from, you know, he's a man of a certain age from a Latin American macho culture, and his idea of women is, aren't they wonderful? My grandma, my mother, what wonderful things they were. And he doesn't really understand the place of women in the modern world sufficiently well to understand how to address this problem. But he knows it's a big issue.
One more call. Sanford, Florida. Brad up next. Go ahead. Let me push the button real quick. Brad, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And how the Curia itself, the internal inside of the Vatican, is going to be evangelized. I mean, we've just been through, and are still going through to some extent, probably the worst crisis that the church has faced since Martin Luther with the, child sex abuse issue. What are they going to do about the clerics themselves in their secret world, having homosexual liaisons? I mean, that's clearly been going on, may even still be going on, and yet they are, they're very hard line on the laity.
Yeah, Francis knows this is a huge problem, and he refers constantly to clericalism. By clericalism, he means the kind of old boys club, the idea that priests should be elevated above other people, should have special privileges, and he's against that. He wants in the Curia, the Roman bureaucracy, he's sending them off on retreats, and he said, you've all got to come. You can't say I'm too busy with the paperwork. I'm going. You've got to come. So he's trying to kind of re-spiritualize a lot of the people who he says have got spiritual Alzheimer's, is his phrase. Last Christmas, he gave a talk to the high-ups in the Roman bureaucracy, and everyone was expecting him to give them a nice, cozy Christmas message ahead of the Christmas party. And he gave them this withering broadside where he said, there are 15 spiritual diseases that I've come across in this place over the past 2 years. And he went through lust for power, lack of empathy for others. The U.S. bishops will know that his harshest words are often reserved for the clerical elite, and he wants to change this, and he's taking steps to do it. But as you suggest, it's a cultural change, and changing cultures is really hard.
The book is Pope Francis, The Struggle for the Soul of Catholicism. Our guest, Paul Vallely. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. It's been interesting.
We will continue on in our discussion, taking a look at Pope Francis as he begins his visit to the United States today and getting your thoughts on it. Go ahead and call the lines now, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, and 202-748-8002 for Independents. We'll take those calls when Washington Journal continues after this.